There's a cocktail sitting on bar counters all over the world. Gin and tonic, crisp, bitter, ordinary. Millions drink it without a second thought. But buried inside that glass, hidden beneath the ice and the lime, is one of the most powerful medicines in human history. A compound so valuable that empires were built on it, wars were fought over it. And then, quietly, deliberately, it was erased from memory and turned into a beverage. This is the story of quinine, the molecule that saved more lives than perhaps any other plant derived drug. The substance that allowed European powers to colonize the tropics, survive the deadliest disease on Earth, and reshape the modern world. And yet today, it exists only as a faint bitterness in your tonic water, a ghost of what it once was. So, how did the most valuable plant in history become a cocktail ingredient? And why was it abandoned? The answer isn't scientific, it's economic. And it reveals something darker about how medicine, profit, and power intersect in ways we're never told. For most of human history, malaria was a death sentence, not just in the tropics, but across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. The disease killed indiscriminately kings, soldiers, peasants, children. Entire armies were wiped out not by battle, but by fever. Ancient Rome fell partly because malaria devastated its population. Alexander the Great likely died from it. It shaped the outcome of wars, the rise and fall of civilizations, and the boundaries of empires. And no one knew how to stop it. Doctors tried everything: bloodletting, herbs, prayer. Nothing worked. The disease came in waves: chills, sweating, delirium, organ failure. You either survived by chance or you didn't. For thousands of years, malaria remained humanity's most persistent enemy. But in the mountains of South America, there was a secret. High in the Andean forests of Peru and Ecuador, the indigenous Quechua people had long known about a tree. It grew wild in the cloud forests, its bark rough and reddish. They called it quinaquina, the bark of barks. And they used it to treat fevers. The knowledge was specific, precise. Strip the bark, dry it, grind it into powder, boil it in water, drink the bitter liquid, and the fevers would stop. European colonizers arrived in South America in the 1600s, and they brought malaria with them. The disease thrived in the humid lowlands. Spanish missionaries, soldiers, and settlers were dying in waves. But the locals weren't. And eventually, someone noticed. The story goes that in 1638, the Countess of Chinchon, wife of the Spanish Viceroy of Peru, fell gravely ill with malaria. Local healers treated her with the bark. She recovered. The news spread. And suddenly, Europe wanted the bark. They called it cinchona, named after the Countess. And it was sent back to Europe by the shipload. For the first time in human history, there was a cure for malaria. Quinine didn't just save lives, it unlocked entire continents. Before cinchona bark, European powers couldn't colonize the tropics. Malaria killed soldiers faster than they could be deployed. Africa was called the white man's grave. Southeast Asia was impenetrable. South America remained unconquerable. The disease was a natural barrier, a biological wall that no army could cross. But with quinine, that wall fell. British officers in India began taking cinchona bark daily as a preventative. They mixed the bitter powder with sugar, water, and eventually gin to make it palatable. That mixture became tonic water. And the gin and tonic was born. Not as a drink, but as medicine. With quinine in hand, the British expanded into India, Africa, and Southeast Asia. The French pushed into Indochina. The Dutch claimed Indonesia. The scramble for empire was no longer limited by disease. Quinine made colonization possible. It became one of the most valuable commodities on Earth, more precious than gold in certain contexts. Governments stockpiled it, armies required it, and entire economies were built around controlling its supply. But there was a problem. Cinchona trees only grew in a small region of South America, and the Spanish and Portuguese controlled that region. For decades, they held a near monopoly on the bark. They regulated exports, they controlled prices, and European powers grew anxious. If you wanted to maintain an empire in the tropics, you needed quinine. And if you didn't control the source, you were vulnerable. So, in the mid 1800s, European powers did what empires do. They stole it. British botanists smuggled cinchona seeds out of South America. The Dutch did the same. They planted the trees in their own colonies. Ceylon, Java, India. They experimented with cultivation, crossbreeding, and chemistry. And eventually they succeeded. By the late 1800s, the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, had become the world's largest producer of cinchona bark. They held 90% of the global supply. They controlled the price, they controlled access, and they controlled the empires that depended on it. Quinine was no longer just medicine, it was geopolitical leverage. And for a time, the system worked. The bark was harvested, the drug was extracted, and malaria, while still deadly, was manageable. If you had access to quinine, but that access was about to be cut off. When World War II began, quinine was still the frontline defense against malaria. Soldiers in the Pacific, Africa, and Southeast Asia depended on it. The Allied forces needed vast quantities to keep troops alive in malaria-prone war zones. But in 1942, Japan invaded Java. Overnight, the Allies lost access to 90% of the world's quinine supply. The Dutch plantations, the cornerstone of global anti-malarial medicine, were now in enemy hands. Soldiers were dying of malaria faster than combat wounds. The US military faced a crisis. Without quinine, the war in the Pacific could be lost before it was fought. The American government responded with urgency. They launched an emergency program to find alternatives. Chemists were mobilized. Labs worked around the clock. And within months, they succeeded. Chloroquine, a synthetic antimalarial drug, was mass-produced and deployed. It was effective. It was cheaper to manufacture. And most importantly, it didn't require a tree. By the end of the war, quinine had been replaced. The age of synthetic antimalarials had begun. And from that moment on, the narrative changed. After the war, pharmaceutical companies saw an opportunity. Synthetic drugs could be patented, natural compounds could not. Quinine had been used for 300 years. It was public domain. No one could own it. No one could control it. But chloroquine, that could be owned. And so could every synthetic drug that followed. Over the next few decades, a new generation of antimalarials was developed. Mefloquine, artemisinin-based combination therapies, ativaquone. Each one was marketed as more effective, more modern, more advanced than the last. Quinine, meanwhile, was quietly phased out. Medical guidelines shifted, textbooks were updated, and within a generation, quinine was remembered only as a historical footnote. It wasn't presented as suppression, it was presented as progress. But there was something the pharmaceutical industry didn't advertise. Malaria is a parasite, and parasites evolve fast. Chloroquine worked until it didn't. By the 1960s, malaria parasites in Southeast Asia had developed resistance. The drug that had replaced quinine was failing. So new drugs were introduced. Mefloquine, sulfadoxine pyrimethamine, and one by one, resistance followed. The malaria parasite adapted to every synthetic thrown at it. Within years, sometimes months, strains would emerge that could survive the drugs. Doctors had to constantly rotate treatments. Pharmaceutical companies had to constantly develop new compounds. And the cycle continued. But here's the thing. Quinine never stopped working. Even after 400 years of use, the malaria parasite has never developed widespread resistance to quinine. There are isolated cases of reduced sensitivity, but nothing like the resistance seen with synthetics. Quinine remains effective. It remains reliable. And in many parts of the world, it's still used as a backup when everything else fails. So, why isn't it the frontline treatment? The answer is simple. Quinine can't be patented, it can't be monopolized, it can't generate the profit margins that synthetic drugs provide. Pharmaceutical companies don't make money off old, effective medicines. They make money off new ones. Even if the new drug is only marginally better, or sometimes worse, it can be marketed, branded, and sold at a premium. Patents last 20 years. During that time, a single drug can generate billions. Quinine offers none of that. It's a natural compound. It's cheap to produce, it's available in generic form, and that makes it economically unattractive. So instead of investing in quinine research, instead of refining its delivery or improving its formulation, the medical establishment moved on. Not because quinine failed, but because it succeeded too well, for too long, and without profit. And the public never questioned it. Because we're taught to trust that medicine is driven by science. That new equals better. That progress is linear. But what if progress isn't about effectiveness? What if it's about control? By the mid 20th century, quinine had been effectively erased from mainstream medicine. It was no longer advertised, no longer prioritized, no longer taught as essential. But it didn't disappear entirely. It was repurposed, rebranded, turned into a beverage additive. Tonic water, originally a medicinal drink used by British colonials to prevent malaria, was now sold as a mixer. The quinine content was reduced to trace amounts, just enough to provide that signature bitter taste, not enough to treat anything. And so, the most powerful anti-malarial in history became a cocktail ingredient. Most people drinking gin and tonic today have no idea they're consuming quinine. They don't know its history. They don't know it once saved empires. They don't know it still works. It's hidden in plain sight. A monument to how thoroughly something can be forgotten. The story of quinine isn't just about a plant. It's about how systems decide what gets remembered and what gets erased. How effective solutions are abandoned when they threaten profitability. How natural medicine is sidelined in favor of synthetic alternatives that can be controlled, patented, and monetized. Quinine worked for 400 years. It still works, but it was replaced. Not by something better, but by something more profitable. And the same pattern repeats across industries. Effective, time-tested solutions are dismissed as outdated. Ancient knowledge is labeled primitive. And we're told to trust the new model, the corporate solution, the patented answer. But sometimes the truth doesn't disappear. It just gets repackaged. There's a medical irony that rarely gets discussed. The very thing that made synthetic drugs attractive, their ability to be engineered, modified, and patented, is also what makes them vulnerable. Synthetic antimalarials are molecularly uniform. They target the malaria parasite in specific, predictable ways. And because of that predictability, the parasite learns. It adapts. Resistance develops. Quinine, by contrast, is chemically complex. It's not a single isolated molecule. It's a blend of alkaloids working in concert. The cinchona bark contains not just quinine, but quinidine, cinchonine, and cinchonidine. Together, they create a multi-target effect that's harder for the parasite to evade. Evolution favors diversity. And natural compounds, by their very nature, are diverse. This is a pattern seen across medicine. Whole plant medicines often resist the development of resistance better than isolated synthetics. Artemisinin, derived from sweet wormwood, faced the same issue when used alone, but when combined with other compounds, it remains effective. The lesson is clear. Nature's complexity is a feature, not a flaw. But modern medicine is built on the opposite assumption. Isolate, purify, simplify, patent. And in that simplification, something is lost. If quinine is so effective, why isn't this common knowledge? Because the history of medicine isn't written by herbalists or historians. It's written by the pharmaceutical industry. And that industry has no incentive to promote a 400-year-old drug that can't be owned. Medical schools teach pharmacology through the lens of modern synthetics. Students learn about chloroquine, artemisinin-based therapies, and cutting-edge antimalarials. Quinine is mentioned briefly, usually as a historical artifact or a last resort option. The narrative is shaped, the curriculum is controlled, and the result is a generation of doctors who don't know that one of the most effective antimalarials in history is still available, still works, and was never actually replaced. Just economically sidelined. This isn't conspiracy, it's incentive structure. When profit drives medicine, effective isn't enough. You need patentable, you need marketable, you need new. And quinine was none of those things. The cinchona tree itself has a quieter tragedy. Once considered the most valuable plant on Earth, it's now largely ignored. After World War II, as synthetic drugs took over, demand for cinchona bark collapsed. The vast plantations in Java and India were abandoned or repurposed. Wild cinchona populations in South America faced overharvesting and habitat destruction. Some species are now endangered. The tree that saved millions of lives is barely cultivated anymore. There's no economic reason to grow it at scale. No pharmaceutical giant is investing in cinchona research. No government is prioritizing its conservation. It's a living reminder of what happens when medicine is driven by markets instead of need. And yet, in some parts of the world, particularly in Africa and South America, quinine is still used. Not by major hospitals or international health organizations, but by local clinics and traditional healers who never forgot. Because while the West moved on, the knowledge survived. Quinine is not an isolated case. It's part of a broader pattern of erasure. Look at elderberry, once widely used for immune support, now dismissed despite mounting evidence of efficacy. Look at willow bark, the original source of aspirin, abandoned once the synthetic version could be patented. Look at cannabis, demonized and criminalized for decades, despite centuries of medicinal use, only to be rediscovered once it became profitable. Again and again, natural medicines are replaced not because they fail, but because they can't be controlled. And the public is taught to view this as progress. So the next time you see a gin and tonic, remember what you're looking at. You're looking at the remnants of a medical revolution. A plant that enabled empires. A molecule that saved more lives than almost any other in history. And you're looking at how easily something that powerful can be erased. Not through force, not through failure, but through economics. Through narrative control. Through the quiet replacement of what works with what profits. Quinine didn't disappear because it stopped being effective. It disappeared because it couldn't be owned. And that's the lesson. Not just about medicine, but about knowledge itself. The most valuable truths aren't always the ones we're told to remember. Sometimes they're hidden in plain sight, diluted, rebranded, turned into something harmless. But the power is still there, buried beneath the ice and the lime, waiting to be recognized. The question is, what else have we forgotten?